Hello, and welcome to the Vlogging Pod. International Women's Day is approaching on March 8th, a day rooted in the fight for political participation, economic fairness, and civic equality. It began as a demand for voting rights, labor protections, and representation. So, as we move toward that date this year, it feels appropriate to ask a simple question. What does political access look like today? And who could be most affected when election rules change? Right now, one of the proposals generating attention is the SAVE Act. The House recently passed a version of the Save American Act, and it has moved to the Senate, where analysts have reported that it faces significant hurdles. Supporters say the bill is designed to ensure that only U.S. citizens vote in federal elections. Opponents argue that its proof of citizenship requirements and related enforcement mechanisms could create barriers for eligible voters. The key point for this conversation is not accusation, but structure. When you change documentation standards, database requirements, and verification systems, you inevitably affect real people navigating those systems. Women are statistically more likely than men to have to experience a legal name change due to marriage or divorce. That matters in a documentation environment that relies heavily on exact name matches across government database, as a mismatch between a birth certificate and a current ID can trigger delays or challenges even when a person is fully eligible to vote. Add to that the reality that women are more likely to serve as primary caregivers and may have less flexibility to take time off work, track down records, or resolve administrative disputes. When the rules tighten, the burden of compliance does not fall evenly. That is not an accusation of intent. It is an observation about how policy mechanics insert with lived realities. Another aspect drawing scrutiny involves data sharing and voter roll oversight. Some analysis of the House version of the SAVE Act note provisions that would increase federal involvement in verifying voter eligibility and potentially require states to share voter registration data with federal authorities. Again, the question is not motive. The question is consequence. Expanded across checking between databases can increase the risk of false positives, where eligible voters are flagged due to clerical errors, outdated records, or similar names. When that happens, voters may be removed from rolls, required to cast provisional ballots, or forced to resolve eligibility disputes under tight deadlines. Historically, large-scale voter roll maintenance efforts have sometimes produced unintended disenfranchisements, particularly when error rates are not carefully managed. This conversation is also unfolding alongside broader debates about federal authority over elections. Last year, the head of this administration signed an executive order addressing federal election oversight and integrity measures. Portions of that order were challenged in court, and federal courts have blocked parts of it. The constitutional structure of U.S. elections gives primary authority to the states, with Congress holding the power to regulate federal elections in certain respects. When federal and state authority collide, the courts often become the referee. That tension is part of the backdrop to current debates. At the same time, public messaging around election integrity continues to reference foreign interface. U.S. intelligence assessments have concluded that foreign actors, including Iran, engaged in influence efforts surrounding the 2020 election. Influence efforts, however, are distinct from evidence that vote totals were altered. That distinction matters. Narratives about foreign interface can shape public perception and can also be used to justify additional security measures. Whether those measures are narrowly tailored or broadly sweeping become the critical question. There have also been renewed discussions in Georgia about the handling of 2020 election materials and investigations connected to that cycle. Reporting has described federal investigation activity related to election records in Fulton County, raising questions about the scope and precedent of federal involvement in local election administration. When you step back, you see multiple threads converging. Legislative proposals, tightening eligibility verification, executive actions attempting to expand federal oversight, ongoing investigations, and public messaging about election integrity, and a midterm election cycle on the horizon. International Women's Day is not just symbolic. It is rooted in the history of access to the ballot. When we look at today's policy environment, the responsible thing to do is not to accuse, but to examine. How do documentation requirements affect people with complex paper trails? How does databases matching affect communities with higher rates of name changes? How does federal oversight interact with state control? And how do narratives about election security shape the policies that follow? Awareness does not require assuming intent. It requires tracing cause and effect. If rules become more complex, participation can become more fragile. If administrative systems expand without precision, eligible voters can get caught up in the margins. And if political power hinges on turnout in midterm elections, then even small barriers can have measurable impact. As we approach March 8th, the question is not whether election security matters. It does. The question is whether the design of security measures preserves access as strongly as it enforces eligibility. Because history shows that when access narrows, the effects are rarely distributed evenly. Today's sources come from Reuters reporting on the House passage and Senate prospects of the Save American Act. Brennan Center analysis of proposed SAVE action provisions and potential voter impact. Executive order text addressing federal election oversight measures. Office of the Director of National Intelligence Assessment on Foreign Influence in the 2020 election. Guardian reporting on federal investigations activity related to Georgia election materials. Thank you for listening. Until next time, bye-bye for now.